Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Hsiao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, regular public seminar series, an annual symposium in the fall. We also have podcasts and cultural programs. If you have not already subscribed to receive all our updates directly in your inbox, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. I'll be remiss if I began today's program without thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, our staff, and as well as our interns. Especially, I want to acknowledge that today's program is made possible by the generous donation of the O Family Charitable and Educational Fund. Let's begin today's program. I'm delighted to present today's very timely public seminar entitled Prospects and Challenges for Expanding Taiwan's Economic Space and Accession into Cptpp. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2021 Index of Economic Freedom, Taiwan's economy ranks 6th freest in the world and 4th among 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Its overall score is well above the regional and world averages. Taiwan is an economic power, but that feature is often shadowed by the security situation in the Taiwan Strait. It is important to take stock of the strategic dimensions of economic power. And on the US-Taiwan bilateral trade front, it's worth noting that goods and services trade between the United States and Taiwan totaled $106 billion in 2020. Taiwan is the United States' 9th largest goods trading partner, and there's been a number of notable trade and economic developments just in the past few months. In late June, the Biden administration held the 11th Trade and Investment Framework Agreement Council meeting, which has been stalled since 2016. And just earlier this week, the United States and Taiwan virtually convened the second U.S.-Taiwan Economic Prosperity Partnership Dialogue, led by the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment, Jose Fernandez, Taiwan's Minister of Economic Affairs, Mei-Hua Wang, and Taiwan's Minister of Science and Technology, Zhong Song-Wu. Yet, despite Taiwan's highly competitive and positive attributes, as outlined earlier, Taiwan remains marginalized in its ability to sign free trade agreements and also in the process of regional economic integration that aim to create even greater efficiencies and volume through establishing multilateral trade linkages that can accelerate growth. Indeed, economic integration in the Indo-Pacific has continued to progress with multilateral agreements such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which has demonstrated that a wide range of nations has a strong interest in the region and remain dedicated to cooperating on matters of trade. With the revival of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States withdrew from in 2017, as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, Cptpp, prospects for regional economic integration appear promising. While Taiwan still remains excluded from the Cptpp, it has nevertheless applied for membership along with the United Kingdom, as well as the People's Republic of China. Now, as Taipei awaits a decision on its application, what lessons can we glean from the UK's application process, as well as from its own accession to the World Trade Organization? What is China's underlying motivation in pushing RCEP, as well as applying for the Cptpp? Moreover, what can the United States, European countries, and especially allies and Cptpp members like Japan do to support Taiwan's effort? And perhaps most importantly, what can Taiwan do for itself? To unpack these issues and more, we have assembled a superset of panelists, and I'll introduce them briefly in the order that they will be speaking. First, we have Shihoko Goto, who is the acting director of the Asia program and deputy director for geoeconomics at the Wilson Center Asia program. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues across the Indo-Pacific and is also focused on the political developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Next, we have Reilly Walters, who is the Deputy Director of the Japan Chair at the Hudson Institute, as well as a Senior Non-Resident Fellow here at the Global Taiwan Institute. He was formerly the Senior Policy Analyst and Economist at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Next, we have Ambassador Michael Radley, who is a former career diplomat with over 30 years of experience, principally handling UK policy towards East and Southeast Asia. Ambassador Radley's final Foreign and Commonwealth Office appointment was as the Director of the British Trade and Cultural Office in Taipei from 2005 to 2009. And in that capacity, he was the de facto British ambassador to Taiwan. Last but not least, we have Terry Cooke, who was the Senior Commercial Officer at the American Institute in Taiwan from 1999 to 2002. Following foreign commercial service postings in Berlin, Tokyo, Shanghai. He's also the founder and managing director of GC3 Strategy Consultancy. Now, I've asked each of the panelists to provide opening comments of around 10 minutes. After all of the panelists have spoken, I will facilitate a discussion by posing a few questions. We are taking questions from the audience, and we would like to hear from you. So please submit your questions via email at contact@globaltaiwan.org or by using the chat function on the YouTube page. You can also tweet us at Global Taiwan. I'll repeat these instructions later in the program. So now I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Shihoko to kick things off with a discussion about current developments related to Cptpp, broader trends in regional economic integration, and Taiwan's position within this emerging regional economic architecture. Shihoko, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Russell, and thank you so much to GTI for hosting this discussion. There's a lot to discuss, but I thought perhaps it would be best to frame my discussion on the past, present, and future of Cptpp all in 10 minutes. So when we look upon the recent past of Cptpp, it's important to bear in mind that the fact that we are at this stage of that trade agreement is remarkable unto itself. Bear in mind that in 2005, it was actually only 4 countries, Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, that formed the core of this group. Other countries joined, and the last country to join in 2013 was actually Japan. And there was a lot of domestic protest against it, and it was a very difficult challenge for then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to ensure that Japan joined. But his argument at the time was to say that this was not only a chance for Japan to be part of a trade agreement that was very ambitious, but it was also perhaps the last time that Japan would be able to be part of a rule-making organization that would have deep consequences. And of course, as Russell referred to, the United States withdrew from TPP in 2017. And at that time, it was not expected to actually move forward. It was with the withdrawal of the United States, the whole agreement was expected to collapse as well. We know, of course, that that was not the case. The agreement was signed and later entered into force by the end of 2018. It is a deal that is first and foremost about the harmonization and enhancing efficiency of regional trade. It addresses non-tariff concerns, and it takes on a multilateral approach to establish rules for issues that go beyond the trade of goods, and especially when it comes to issues like e-commerce and digital trade. Cptpp has been a game changer over the last 4 years. It's actually coincided with rising US-China tensions, the isolation that we've had as a result of COVID, and with that, a increased wariness about globalization. And it's emerged as the de facto regional economic framework and a goal for growth for the region as well. So when we look at the present trade challenges, as we celebrate Thanksgiving here in the United States, we're all particularly aware of items that might be missing, costs that are rising. And these are some of the issues that really are on the trade agenda. It isn't just about issues of critical supplies and identifying critical industries. It really does hit everyone for their individual spending. And so the focus of trade is really less about market access these days and much more about economic security and a resilience to disruptions. So that has led to greater focus on domestic capacity building. It's also led to a more inward-looking protectionist approach to trade as well. And we've also seen a fracturing of value chains and a reassessment of logistics networks, which includes and goes beyond the critical supplies. And as a result, we've seen an emergence of competing spheres of supply chains. And so on the one hand, we have the United States focusing on essentially de-China-fying its supply chain. And on the other hand, we have China focusing on enhancing its own domestic capabilities and promoting a so-called dual circulation economy as well. And so we have these two competing spheres of trade groups and trade interests. And countries and governments with that are highly specialized in the global value chain and the fractured supply chains actually leaves them incredibly vulnerable. Now, membership to the Cptpp won't immediately solve these issues related to supply chain resiliency, given that Cptpp is first and foremost focused on tariff reduction. But to be part of a group that focuses on standardization and harmonization of rules in the absence of an economic vision for the region is very much something that many countries, many governments are looking to. And it's the closest thing to an economic roadmap that we have for the Indo-Pacific, bringing together like-minded countries, but also countries that share interests that might necessarily have very different governance structures. And they are united through their commitment to transparency and their desire for efficiency, and that becomes their common agenda. So as we look to the future of Cptpp is very much about expansion, and the membership to the trade agreement has become highly attractive to many countries, and it should be welcomed by the current founding 11 member countries. But at the same time, the process of accession has become increasingly politicized. Of course, the United Kingdom surprisingly became the first country to make the bid for entry beyond the founding members. And then we had, of course, the PRC declaring its interest, with Taiwan following a week later. Korea now is expected to make a bid for entry as well. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that from declaration to entry is not only not guaranteed, but it is also a very long and cumbersome and arduous task. It requires a great deal of negotiation, and it also requires consensus amongst the founding member countries as well. Each government that has recently declared its interest to join has its own political as much as economic reasons to join, and some countries and some governments are far more ready for accession than others. The UK accession negotiations have been well underway since summer, and currently they are currently negotiating terms of market access. And there also needs to be steps to be taken for reform in order to comply by the rules to ensure that it's possible. China is currently at the stage where it needs to demonstrate its readiness to adhere to the CPTPP rules. And that in itself is a big if. Is China going to be able to demonstrate its readiness? So the conclusion, of course, of this is that the CPTPP is at the heart of the Indo-Pacific's economic roadmap. There is great discrepancy between a roadmap for security, military security in the region led by the United States that contrasts sharply with that of the economic architecture, where both the United States as well as India, the biggest democracy in the region, is notably absent from mega trade deals as well. But given where we are, CPTPP will only increase in its importance, and it is a manifestation of the binding power of shared interests that do bring Asian governments together, regardless of the stage of economic development they may be or the governance structure they are pursuing. So let me leave it at that for now.
Wonderful, Shihoko, and thank you so much. That's an excellent overview. I think you put a lot of issues on the table for us to be able to pick up on in the discussion following. In particular, I think one of the issues that I think is worth really unpacking is really the dangers of further economic marginalization of Taiwan from these regional groupings, and what real impacts that could potentially have, not only just in the economic, but in the security and in the political realms. And I think that perhaps is an element that in a very siloed sort of approach to understanding economics, and trade issues, that it gets left out of the broader discussion. But perhaps that might be changing somewhat. Terry, if I can just ask you to mute yourself, just so that while you're not speaking right now, because I think that it's creating some background noises, and that would be very helpful. Thanks, Terry. Okay, next, Reilly, I want to turn it over to Reilly to provide his assessment of the prospects and challenges for Taiwan's application to CPTPP and then other bilateral trade and economic agreements with a focus on the U.S. Reilly, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. And, I think this is a real timely event. Next month will be the 3-year anniversary of the CPTPP coming into force. And of course, with the application of Taiwan to join this year, I think it's definitely timely and worthwhile to explore a lot of this. One of the things I really want to focus on today is Taiwan's own application into joining the CPTPP, and not get too caught up in the conversation about China's application to join, which maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. But first and foremost, I think we want to answer this question of, can Taiwan join the CPTPP? And I believe so. I think many would agree. Taiwan is its own member of the World Trade Organization. It's its own member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And what these go to show and really mean is that Taiwan can negotiate its own trade deals separate from China. It is its own separate customs territory. And in fact, Taiwan actually already has trade agreements with 2 CPTPP members, Singapore and New Zealand. So there really shouldn't be any doubt in the CPTPP members or anyone's minds whether Taiwan can negotiate its own membership into the CPTPP. Now, for Taiwan's own application and whether it can join, I think it would be relatively easy for Taiwan to join economically, as Shihoko was kind of alluding to. Politically, maybe not so much, or at least it'll be a little bit more difficult for Taiwan to join CPTPP politically. And so what does this mean? So economically speaking, Taiwan is an open society. It is a pretty free economy with low barriers to entry. Russell, as you alluded to, as you mentioned earlier in this event, according to the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, Taiwan ranks 6th overall in the world for being economically free. And this is above many CPTPP members' own economic freedom. If you look at, for example, for other statistics from the World Trade Organization, Taiwan has an applied tariff rate, or basically a tax on imports on agricultural and non-agricultural goods that's really not much higher than Japan's. Japan being, I think, one of the leading members of Cptpp. Its applied tariff rate is maybe just a couple percentage points higher. So really, it's not, there aren't too many tariff barriers, I think, for Taiwan's membership into Cptpp to worry about, though there may be some non-tariff barriers that Taiwan will have to address. I believe that Taiwan does have a lot of, there will be a lot of concerns around Taiwan's restrictions on, for example, agricultural trade. Agricultural trade, of course, tends to be very political, I think, in Taipei. If we're thinking about the US-Taiwan context, there was a lot of contention for quite a while around pork and beef trade. And I know, for example, right now, there's still some concerns about importing products from the Fukushima region in Japan. That could be a problem when negotiating Cptpp membership with Tokyo, for example. And so, there's probably various concerns amongst many of the Cptpp members around agricultural trade. Taiwan also still has quite a few state-owned enterprises and non-tariff barriers that exist, but I believe that Taipei could easily address many of these concerns with the CPT members through this long negotiation process. And Taipei has already said that it's willing to try and clear some of these economic hurdles through the negotiation process, such as reforming its trademark and patent laws, ensuring greater transparency in its regulatory system, making sure that that its intellectual property protections are up to what we, I guess, considered international standards. And Taiwan basically saying Taipei is willing to address many of these concerns, and for good reasons. If we talk about sort of Taiwan's membership in the CPTPP, I believe Taipei understands better than anyone the need to join CPTPP. The coronavirus, the pandemic, the effect it's had on our supply chains has really gone to show the need to diversify our global value chains, our global supply chains, more recently. But one of the things that Taiwan has been dealing with for many years now is the fact that it's actually being left out of many of these trade agreement negotiations. And so, Taiwan joining CPTPP could help diversify a lot of this, not just for Taiwan, of course, but for many of the CPTPP members who are looking to do exactly this. They're looking to diversify their supply chains. Domestically speaking, joining CPTPP could be a boost to Taiwan's own economy, of course. By one estimate, joining CPTPP could help Taiwan's economy grow by 2%. And by not joining, it's estimated that it could lose out on 0.5 percentage of growth. So Taiwan, I think, wants to clear many of these economic hurdles, but again, there are political hurdles that might be a little bit more difficult. And these aren't really issues that can be solved within Taipei. These are issues, of course, with the CPTPP members, and of course Beijing. So looking forward, what does that mean? So there are 11 CPTPP members. Only 8, of course, have to come to a consensus over whether Taiwan can join. Brunei, Chile, and Malaysia haven't actually ratified the CPTPP agreement within their home countries, so they don't really actually get a vote on building a consensus, though their voices are still taken into consideration through this whole negotiation process. There is a big China factor in all of this, in weighing into political decisions of CPTPP members, whether to allow Taiwan to join. And when Taiwan made its application, CPTPP members were generally objective. I think when we sort of see trade negotiations happen, that tends to be what happens. Is I think negotiators want to be objective. They want to temper expectations. They don't want to come out either too supportive or too negative of any respective applicant. There was one outlier, of course, which I think is Japan. Japan was almost very supportive of Taiwan's membership, but that's because the leading political party in Tokyo actually, I think, more or less cleared the way for Taiwan's application back in June when it published a policy report saying, hey, maybe we should let Taiwan join the Cptpp. Now, if we're thinking about sort of the region as a whole, there is a U.S.-sized hole, a gap missing in all of this. How does the U.S. sort of how does the U.S. kind of contribute to any of this, to the negotiation process? Not being a member of Cptpp, not really having trade agreements with a lot of these members, and honestly, the U.S. I think is trying to play catch up in the region when it comes to trade issues. But I think it can have a role to play in helping support Taiwan's membership. Having a strong relationship with Japan, Canada and Mexico, of course, it can help support Taiwan's own membership into the Cptpp. But it is also engaging with Taiwan if we're sort of taking a step outside of the Cptpp context. As you mentioned already, Russell, the U.S. and Taiwan, they do have this trade and investment framework agreement that we've been holding for almost 30 years now. And we do have this more recent economic prosperity partnership dialogue with Taiwan. Of course, we don't actually have a free trade agreement with Taiwan, which is, I think, something that we're missing. But through these other programs, the TIFA and the Economic Prosperity Dialogue, there's a lot of good engagement between the U.S. and Taiwan. A lot of discussion on strengthening supply chains, looking toward the digital economy and other areas for U.S.-Taiwan cooperation. But for the U.S., I'm concerned about its sort of ad hoc approach to the region. It is very much lacking, I think, in the trade space, and so hopefully, I hope Taiwan can succeed where the U.S. is failing. I hope that Taiwan can join. I think it is going to be a long negotiation process, and there will be some political challenges more so than economic challenges, I believe. But I think the U.S. can be supportive of Taiwan in many of this. I think Japan can play a supporting role as well, and hopefully it won't be too much of a hassle negotiating this, but we will wait and see. And so with that, thank you very much.
Superb, Reilly. I think you hit the nail on the head in making the point that Taiwan can negotiate, its own trade agreements, and that it's not a legal bar or an economic bar for that matter, given many of the Taiwan's economic capacity, but it's largely a political one, and I think that the difficulty there is really trying to to try to address that the political challenges and thinking sort of more holistically about approaches to expanding Taiwan's economic space. And I think you rightfully noted that that there are existing mechanisms like the WTO and the APEC, where Taiwan is a member of, and perhaps those are sort of venues where that we need to explore further about how to enhance Taiwan's ability to participate and contribute, and also be able to build economic trade relations with other countries, but even also more on the recently launched with the second annual economic partnership prosperity partnership dialogue, and examining how that we could potentially utilize that mechanism to further these goals. So so next I want to turn it over to Ambassador Michael Radley, and I think this oftentimes when we talk about Taiwan's economic space here in Washington, we focus, of course, primarily on the U.S. dimension here, but there's obviously a very important European dimension too in terms of overall trade with Taiwan, but also in particular as it relates to Cptpp, the fact that the UK has formally applied, I believe in February of this year, and I think I heard from on the news that some trade officials in the UK think that the UK could exceed as early as in 2022. But obviously that's that's subject to change. But so I want to turn over to Michael now to discuss what we can learn from the UK's accession process into the Cptpp, as well as his assessments on European trade and investment relations with Taiwan. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Russell, and good morning to everybody. You've asked me to look at two distinct topics, so I'll look at each of them in turn, starting with the UK's application and accession process into the Cptpp. There are two key points about this which make it very different to Taiwan's application. The first is that the decision to apply was overwhelmingly a political one, even an ideological one, rather than an economic or trade-related decision. The driver behind it was basically the current government's wish simply to distance itself from the EU following Brexit on ideological grounds. And this desire gave rise to the concept of global Britain, which so far has been far more soundbite than strategy. It's largely rhetoric, lots of repeated references to free trade and a tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. But from a political and an ideological point of view, joining the Cptpp fits very neatly with this, even more so as three of the current members of the Cptpp are what here we would call old Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, and thickening up ties with them goes very much to the imperial nostalgia that's driving much of the ideology behind Brexit. Compared to the politics, the economic impact for the UK of joining will be modest, and that's to put it very politely. Current UK trade with Cptpp members is small. Its combined exports to all 11 members don't even reach 75% of its current exports to Germany alone. And it does more trade with Ireland, a country of just 5 million people, than it does with Japan, which is its largest partner within a trade partner within the Cptpp. The second point is that actually the real initiative for this came not from within the UK itself, although the idea had been there, but actually from former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, after he'd said in October 2018 that the UK would be welcome with open arms to join. And there's some background to this, which again is Brexit related, in that Japan, arguably more than any other country outside the UK itself, feared losses from the consequences of Brexit. Its companies had invested heavily in the UK as their preferred location within the EU single market. So much so that at the time of the referendum, something like 5% of all employees in the manufacturing sector here were working for Japanese-owned companies. And the Japanese felt very strongly that they had been encouraged and invited by the UK government to come and set up in the UK. So the outcome of the referendum left them feeling that the UK had actually reneged on a long-standing promise. And perhaps because of that, when the UK initially suggested to Japan negotiating a new bilateral free trade agreement after Brexit, the Japanese rebuffed them. Then they modified their position, but took a very tough line, unlike Korea, for example. But this was happening almost in parallel to Trump's election as president and then his very early withdrawal of the US from the TPP. And as Shihoko said, Abe realized that membership of the Cptpp gave Japan the last real chance to be at the heart of making rules in a new trade organization. And so with the US pulling out, Japan seized this opportunity to try to shape the global trading system to its own benefit. And the invitation to the UK to join should be seen very much from that perspective and in that context. Now, having formally launched the accession process early this year, I think that the UK government may just be starting to realise that membership won't be anything like as straightforward as its politicians had perhaps assumed. not because of objections from members, but actually because of the implications for the UK itself. And if I give two examples here, the first is from agriculture. The EU maintains very high standards in things like animal welfare, environmental protection, the use of additives in food production. As an example, until this year, Taiwan banned the import of pork containing ractopamine, eventually giving in to very heavy US pressure to lift the ban. The EU, by contrast, actually has a blanket ban on the use of ractopamine in any meat. Now, there have been already early signs from a bilateral trade agreement with Australia that the UK is actually very willing, almost enthusiastic, again, for ideological reasons, to move away from EU standards in food and agriculture, but also gradually over time to lift tariffs on agricultural produce entirely. But under the WTO rules, if it eases tariffs for one country, it's got to do that for all WTO members, which opens the way, in theory at least, for cut-price US food imports in the longer term. So if UK farmers find that the EU market is closed because we no longer meet European sanitary and phytosanitary standards, while at the same time we're facing increased competition from lower-cost producers in Australia and New Zealand, let alone perhaps the USA, then there's a very high likelihood of a strong domestic backlash. And the second example is the impact on domestic regulation. Again, just taking one area, at present, again, because of past EU membership, we have very high standards for data protection. But it's not at all clear that these standards are compatible with Cptpp rules. Because in the EU, data privacy is a citizen's fundamental right. By contrast, the US has tended to take a much more market-driven approach to data privacy. And so far, digital trade agreements within the Asia Pacific are seeming to follow the US model rather than the EU one. Again, I wouldn't underestimate the risks of a domestic backlash here if citizens suddenly feel that their rights and protections over use of data are being taken away from them. So what does this mean in terms of lessons for Taiwan? The first one is that Japanese support for its application is essential, and as Reilly has already said, that's more or less on the cards. However, to be sure of that, I think a clear end to the ban on Fukushima-related food imports is also essential. I would argue that Taiwan's actually been very slow on this. It should have moved quicker on this. As it hasn't, it's now in the position where its application to join is behind that of China. But also, because the whole thing of consensus, it does need to ensure that it's smoothed the path with other members. And there are lots of possibilities here. Just one example I would flag up. The Australian government at the moment, in its rhetoric at least, is pretty pro-Taiwan. But there are elections next year. The current polls are putting the ruling Liberal Party neck and neck with the Labour Party, which historically has been much more pro-China. So I'm not saying that Australia will shift its position. I'm just saying that Taiwan needs to be working on its strategy in respect of Australia and working for both eventualities. And it's got to be doing the same with the other members too. The second lesson is Taiwan's going to have to take steps to meet Cptpp standards. How far, for example, is it going to be prepared to open its agricultural markets or to amend its domestic standards and regulations to comply? Now, I'm not actually aware of any insuperable obstacles in this area. I think it's all manageable, but I do feel that so far the Taiwanese government has not done anywhere near enough to sell to the domestic electorate the benefits of membership and to prepare it for the changes which will have to be implemented. So it's going to be facing lots of, I think, quite vigorous protests from lobby groups and vested interests, which are going to be harder to deal with because it has been slow in facing up to them. This then leads on to EU-Taiwan trade and investment relations. 6 years ago, the then EU Trade Commissioner said that the EU would, and I quote, explore launching negotiations on an investment agreement with Taiwan. It's fair to say that I think Taiwanese reactions at the time were rather underwhelming. There had been hoping then and subsequently that they might get a free trade agreement. But from the EU's perspective, it was still a big step forward. But progress since has actually been pretty modest and very low key, certainly not spectacular. But although there's still no formal agreement as yet, there has been a steady increase in sectoral level discussions of semiconductors, for example, supply chains and investment. So there has been progress. And the EU was actually on the point of agreeing to upgrade all these sectoral discussions to what it calls a strategic dialogue, only suddenly to postpone the plans as recently as last week. And I suspect that this actually puzzled and frustrated a lot of people in Taiwan, given what they had seen as a warm of EU attitudes. Joseph Wu, the foreign minister, recently had a successful visit, lots of pro-Taiwanese statements from the European Parliament. But it reflects the complications of the way that the EU works. Trade policy is a responsibility of the European Commission, and that's been in negotiations with China for many years over an investment agreement. So the Commission's engaged in a balancing act. It's concerned it doesn't want to get too far ahead with Taiwan, the fear of upsetting China, with which obviously its trade is about 10 times as big as that with Taiwan. That said, my personal view is that Commission officials are overly sensitive to Chinese lobbying and susceptible to Chinese pressure. But EU governments are also divided, so while Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia may appear very supportive, others such as Cyprus and Spain are much more cautious or more pro-China. But in practice, although this sounds cumbersome, I would argue that actually the EU position is not so different to that within the US until recently, where Congress historically and generally has always been very supportive, the State Department less so. But the US Trade Representative's Office traditionally took a very hard-nosed approach, focusing narrowly on the trade aspects and benefits for the US. And I would argue that the Commission isn't unlike the USTR in this respect. The big difference is that total EU-Taiwan trades only just over half of Taiwan-US trade, even though the EU is a much larger market. And this, I think, highlights what the real problem is it's just mutual indifference. There aren't any real champions on either side in Europe or Taiwan who are willing to put pressure on officials to push for progress. And it seems to me that one way forward from which they could take an example from the recent Taiwan-US Economic Prosperity Dialogue is maybe a set of business advisory groups who would actually try to identify common goals and work together to press the officials for change. I'll stop there. If people are interested, I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Wonderful, Ambassador Reilly. I think that was a very nuanced analysis, and I think you laid out, I think, what the challenges are ahead, and I think the lessons learned, the way that you broke out the various lessons, are very instructive and helpful, and the point about sort of the political, ideological, or maybe even strategic motivations for UK's application to the Cptpp and the considerations of other trading nations in forming or participating in regional economic agreements, at least seems to me overall as somewhat of a positive sign in terms of the stars sort of aligning on sort of looking at economics and trade relations in a more broader strategic level. But as you've noted also as well, is that those variables can change, those political variables can change, and so. It's definitely important to keep close tabs on these matters and observe carefully and to have a realistic assessment on what the prospects as well as the challenges are ahead. And so finally, I want to close by turning the virtual podium over to Terry, who will be giving us his take on what we can learn from the accession process of Taiwan with the WTO, and for how the process of the Cptpp may play out, and also as well as other avenues to consider in expanding Taiwan's economic space. Terry, over to you.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you to the GTI. And it's a pleasure to be with these other distinguished panelists. Russell asked me to take a step back and look at the Cptpp issue from the broader perspective of the WTO accession. I had the privilege of being at the American Institute in Taiwan, actively engaged with the lead up to the WTO joint accession involving China and literally minutes later, Taiwan, back in December of 2001. And my broad conclusion for this purpose, for the purposes of this panel and for consideration of the Cptpp, is that there's quite little applicability in my mind between the experience 20 years ago with WTO process and today's process with the Cptpp. I will try to just quickly back up that assertion by looking first at what's happened in China over the 20 years, then also looking at particularly the semiconductor industry, how that has changed over the past 20 years, and then take a tighter view in view of these two 20-year dynamics, one political, one industrial, taking a quick look at how the Biden administration appears to be positioning itself both with its domestic policies and with its allies, and what that would suggest for the Cptpp. So from December of 2001, I think there was a sense of satisfaction in Washington based on the Washington consensus model that with China into the WTO, there would be a gradual convergence of Chinese business practices to conform with the Western post-World War II model. And particularly, there was excitement about the potential for meaningful economic reforms happening in the years ahead. Then, of course, in 2008, we hit the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. And as a trained cultural anthropologist, my personal view is that that was a watershed event in changing the attitude of decision makers in Zhongnanhai in terms of how they looked to the West for guidance and as a model to follow. 2010 was what American diplomats called China's year of living dangerously, as they took certain new, some provocative actions. In 2012, with the 18th Party Congress, you saw what I think had been probably 3 or 4 years of backroom discussions suddenly breaking the surface internationally and suggesting a new direction in the thinking of the leadership. And that then became personalized with Xi Jinping's role in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress, his triumphalist speech, and more recently, his increasingly authoritarian moves. So, parallel to all that, the semiconductor industry has emerged as the really the most vital industry for our evolution into a 21st century economy. I did some writing and testimony back in the period 2001, 2002, 2003 about the strategic supply chain between the US, China, and Taiwan as involved semiconductors. But to put the most recent 20 years into perspective, and particularly what's going to be happening with that industry in the years ahead, Tom Caulfield, the CEO of Global Foundries, who just completed his deal with Ford, has been explaining that it took the semiconductor industry 50 years to reach a $5 trillion, a $500 billion valuation. And that needs to be doubled in the next 5 to 10 years as semiconductors become an increasingly vital part of automotive production, telecommunications equipment, aerospace equipment. It is simply the industry to follow. And that leads to the often cited strategic risk of having the vast preponderance of the TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, produces 40% of the world's chips, 80% of the world's most advanced chips. They use predominantly US designs, but also Korean, European, and Chinese designs. But until recently, almost all of that production has been localized within Taiwan, 90 miles across the straits from China. So the third and final point that I'll make has to do with what I see, reading tea leaves a little bit, but the Biden administration's response both to the dynamic happening in China as well as the dynamic happening with industry. He has, in my mind, signaled what he's doing, but it hasn't always been. John Bolton just the other day gave the editorial, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you, essentially saying that the Biden administration hasn't shown a China policy. And whatever China policy there is needs to be enunciated and explained much more thoroughly to the American people. My reading is that he has been clear with what he's doing. He started with his focus on getting the pandemic under control and reviving a sclerotic economic situation in the US. And he's done now guardrail summits with Putin and Xi Jinping, both designed to stabilize in the near term two fairly volatile relationships. He's then proceeded to dismantle with EU partners a number of tariffs that were causing the greatest tension in US-EU relations. Just weeks ago, he sent USTR Representative Tai and US Commerce Department Secretary Raimondo on a tour of Asia, the more democratic leaning constituency in Asia. And he's leading up to the Summit of the Democracies in December. I think it will be at and following the Summit of the Democracies that the beginning of a specific China policy will start to be enunciated. And I think it's a very telling indicator that TSMC's announcements about its increasing pace of global foundry investment outside of Taiwan is very much in line with the Summit of the Democracies trajectory. TSMC has announced a $7 billion investment in Japan. Those are older chips for cars and consumer electronics, but still will contribute greatly to straightening out problems with supply chains. TSMC previously announced its $12 billion fabrication plant in Arizona, a more sophisticated chip, 5 nanometer, for smartphones and CPUs. And TSMC is evaluating the potential of additional investment in the EU, and particularly Germany seems to be a country of interest. So with that, I'll just stop. I think those dynamics have really altered what the situation was in 2001, and it's really an entirely different set of calculations that's going to inform what happens with Cptpp.
That's great, Terry. And if I may just sort of extrapolate from, those explanation of the dynamics of at play from, from 20 years ago, is that what you're seeing is a fundamental transformation in terms of the nature of the circumstances as well as the regime in China that, essentially would make, the considerations for what would happen to China's accession into Cptpp not applicable to its accession process in WTO. In some ways, perhaps if I were, and I know, and then correct me if I think what the conclusion I'm drawing from I think your analysis, which the trend line is that that even though perhaps China may not be able to join the Cptpp, it will still be able to spoil Taiwan's ability to do so, politically, right? I mean, and following that, I mean, just in terms of looking at ways and avenues of how to expand Taiwan's economic space, it's semiconductors, right? In some ways, in really trying to figure out how to leverage that in a matter of being able to really to try to enhance Taiwan's role in the international community in this sort of economic realm. But do correct me if I'm wrong there, but nevertheless, I want to remind all our viewers that we are taking questions from the audience. So please submit your questions via email at contact@globaltaiwan.org. Please remember to put and to include your name as well as affiliations. Those that include that information will be prioritized. You can also tweet us at Global Taiwan or use the chat function on the YouTube page. So we'll be turning to audience questions about 15 minutes before the close of today's session, but I want to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and pose a few questions that I teed up a bit in some commentaries that I made after the statements made by the various speakers. But I do want to focus a bit on the just recently concluded economic prosperity partnership dialogue that was just held earlier this week. And I wanted to get a sense in terms of the idea, your thoughts, the panelists' thoughts, and this is an open-ended question for all the panelists, but the feasibility of potentially broadening out the EPPD to include other partners. And I'm thinking like sort of looking at a sort of a GCTF model, right, which is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework that was launched between the United States and Taiwan back in 2015. And now that Japan in recent years also joined as a formal coordinating partner, but essentially the three partners would organize international workshops that has participation by officials from and civil society from all various countries on focus on areas from transnational crime to digital economy to issues of women empowerment as well as energy security and public health, and this has been a very effective vehicle for addressing these issues where Taiwan certainly has very important assets and contribution to make, but perhaps this EPPD could provide an economic and trade and investment track to the GCTF model, and I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think of that idea, and perhaps since we have Shihoko and Michael here, the potential of Japan as well as UK, for that matter. I mean, perhaps it's but also open to the other parts of it. What what you guys think about that that potentiality. Right, Shihoko, you want to go first? Oh, you're muted right now.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I think the dialogue it's substantive, but yes, of course. But the symbolism of actually bringing Washington, and Taipei together speaks volumes. And yes, we spent a great deal of time today talking about the importance of the semiconductor industry over the last decades, and the world literally cannot run without chips. And Taiwan dominates in that sector. But if we look at some of the Biden administration foreign policy priorities, yes, we can discuss about the clarity or lack thereof of the Biden administration's China policy. We can also talk about the clarity or lack thereof of Biden's economic policy. But there are a number of priorities that it has laid out, and one of them is dealing with the pandemic. Another one is dealing with social justice, and another one is about dealing with environmental concerns. And certainly when it comes to dealing with the pandemic, Taiwan really has gone above and beyond what most governments have done. And it has actually been an example of being able to keep the spread in check, especially in the initial stages of the pandemic. And it also has really advanced on the diplomatic aspect of dealing with the global health crisis in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing equipment, the mask diplomacy of this mass distribution of facial masks across the world has really given, has really demonstrated Taiwan's presence in the global arena. Its marginalization from international organizations, not just the UN itself, but also from the WHO, has been seen as a detriment to the world as it continues to deal with this pandemic. So I think having this comprehensive approach to dealing with Taiwan that goes simply beyond in enhancing FDI from Taiwan to advance America's critical supplies chain is certainly something that needs to be done. Also, we talk about the Summit of the Democracies coming up. And of course, in that respect too, when we talk about two Chinas, two models for China in the future, the Taiwan model is that of democratic governance, and that of allowing, listening to, and responding to the voice of the people. And that dovetails very nicely, meshes very well with the Biden administration's expectations and foreign policy goals. So I think we're going to see greater partnership, comprehensive partnership. And Russell, you talk about leveraging Taiwan's current, high. I think what that leveraging is yes, recognizing where Taiwan's chip producing capabilities and technology know-how is something that really needs to be highlighted, but it also becomes this opportunity to look at Taiwan for what it is and its amazing success as this flourishing democracy. And so hopefully this dialogue will actually expand that beyond agencies, beyond the State Department, beyond the Commerce Department as well.
Great. Any other takers from this panel?
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts. I really appreciate the economic partnership, prosperity partnership. I wrote about this years ago, how we needed sort of a new high-level dialogue between the United States and Taiwan. And I think this is sort of a response to that. I think it was also a response to the last administration's trade representative, basically, not engaging with Taiwan on our trade and investment framework agreement negotiations. I would be hesitant about expanding it out, though. I mean, not the economic partnership, prosperity partnership idea itself, with the U.S. and other countries, but outside of the bilateral context. When you start engaging with more people, other countries, you tend to have to start considering consensus. I would actually argue that maybe it's, you really shouldn't think about expanding the economic partnership, prosperity partnership, to include, the U.S. and Taiwan and plus others, but instead keep that as a bilateral focus and expand more on the Quad side. So not, the Quad isn't a formal agreement in itself, and I'm not saying that we should include other new informal members, but there must be some sort of way to expand the framework, the negotiations that the U.S. has with Japan, Australia, and India, to be able for other countries, other interested partners to be able to sort of adopt or opt into these agreements in some way, because I believe that's the whole premise of the Quad, is to sort of build a consensus amongst not just the developed but developing economies throughout the United States and throughout Asia, in order for others to sort of adopt something that's relatively acceptable. So I sort of look toward that end in this regard. Now I think for the EPP, the Economic Prosperity Partnership, we also have to remember that there are some things, I think, within that are already expandable. I think the State Department's Clean Networks Initiative, for example, I think that was a big part of this dialogue, and so that, I think, itself too is something that the United States wanted to expand regionally or globally even. So it's a little bit piecemeal. You kind of have to break these things apart, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I would be too hesitant about just saying that this really great bilateral initiative between the United States and Taiwan should no longer be a bilateral thing. It should be a trilateral, quadrilateral, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. And I really liked how Michael, you had something you wanted to add to us as well.
I mean, I very much agree with Shihoko. I take Reilly's point, but actually from where I sit, I would see it a bit differently. To me, a lot would depend on the success and speed of Taiwan's application to join Cptpp. But if you look at it from Taiwan's position, it is so marginalized internationally that anything it can do to actually enhance its international engagement is positive for all sorts of reasons, but China-related primarily. Those contacts and engagement for the time being are going to be overwhelmingly in the trade sector. So if you can build on the economic and prosperity dialogue to expand that gradually into things like cooperation on healthcare, and from then into the pandemic response and so on, that's a plus. But also, two things. First of all, outside the US, I think most countries are going to remain very, very hesitant about getting into any sort of formal dialogue with Taiwan. And we've just seen the European Union step back from its equivalent to the EPP dialogue. The reason, but if the EU is hesitant to do it, nobody else, I think, is going to take a leap forward. On the other hand, from the UK perspective, if the US says to it, look, why don't you come and join us in this with Taiwan? I think the UK would say yes. It'll say something very different to Washington to what it would say to Taipei. But I think there's another angle from the US's point of view as well, which is, don't look at this just in the bilateral US-Taiwan perspective. Look at it in terms of the US's broader interests in Northeast Asia. And one of the things that has worried a lot of observers is the fractious, for want of a better word, state of relations between Korea and Japan. And these aren't just security partners, these are very important trading partners. And the more that they can be brought into a dialogue on issues, because like Taiwan, they're democracies, they face the same issues. They need to be talking both to themselves and with Taiwan. And I would see real scope for an enlarged but still limited dialogue, embracing perhaps Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the US, maybe the UK, or the EU, but really no wider than that. But I think it would help Taiwan enormously, and I think it would also be beneficial for the region as well.
Well, I'll just add for the record, because I've already been, quoted and written about this in a number of occasions. But I was particularly fond of Terry's when Terry raised the idea of connecting this with the Summit of Democracies, and suggesting that the trips taken by U.S. trade and commerce officials, senior commerce officials to the region, had a hint of being focused on other democracies, and suggesting there's a strategic rationale behind the growing sense of democracies needing to trade more with one another. And as a strong proponent of illegal democracies, as well as the need for democracy to trade more with one another and strengthening those linkages, I do hope that Terry is right, and that and that the Biden administration is looking at trade and economic issues in a broader strategic manner that weaves together the importance of strengthening economic ties amongst democracies. And I take Michael's points there in terms of enlarging a dialogue and the utility of that as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities.
Russell, and if I may just add
please.
one note to that. I've had no direct involvement in really any talks with any of the countries that are directly having their applications for Cptpp. So I'm really just talking at a gut level from an individual perspective. But the scenario that I don't see as likely is China's application being accepted anytime soon. There are too many barriers with their state-owned enterprises, and the direction of increasing state-owned control in Xi Jinping's 2022 effort. Politically, I don't see it as likely that the Biden administration is going to kind of stick its neck out politically prior to 2022 midterm elections and make any noises about the US possibly reapplying or applying to rejoin. I think the interesting scenario is not assuming that a Taiwan entry or Taiwan acceptance without being led into it by the US is impossible, or to assume that if there's an attempt for Taiwan if Taiwan should be accepted, that it would mean inevitably that China would find a way to nullify that. So I personally feel that that is a scenario that people should think about, and possibly public announcement from the Biden administration about opening a free trade agreement discussion with Taiwan could bolster that dynamic.
Thanks for that. Very important points. I want to shift gear quickly before turning to the audience questions here. I know this is we focused a lot of the international external variables here, and I want to turn quickly to Taiwan's domestic circumstances. And Michael, you raised this in terms of some of the barriers on Fukushima imports of goods, and Taiwan is slated to hold a pretty pivotal referendum in December, and this was delayed from when it was held originally scheduled for August, but due to the COVID outbreak, they postponed it. And one of the initiatives on the referendum is to ban the import of pork products containing ractopamine that the present administration in Taiwan has, and President Tsai herself has taken quite a lot of political risk to unilaterally to remove those restrictions. But public opinion seems to support the referendum banning Brachtoberman, with, I think, one recent poll indicating that maybe 68%, or so respondents expressed support for the initiative, while only around 25% or so opposed it. What, in your view, and this is open to the panel, what are the implications that the prospects of this referendum passing, this particular referendum passing on Taiwan's economic space, and that's relations with the U.S. and more broadly speaking on on Cptpp perhaps. Any thoughts? Reilly, I would call on you if you want.
I think Michael's trying to say something.
Oh, Michael was okay. Sorry, I didn't hear Michael.
Sorry, I didn't
Go ahead, Michael.
Reilly first, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, it's not a simple solution. Obviously, the United States and Taiwan had this problem as a bilateral issue for quite some time, and it really had, real effect. I mean, that's why the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement was effectively, stopped for the whole Trump administration. To be fair, though, I guess to the Tsai administration, this can be hard because, they announced this lifting of the ban in efforts of, hopefully starting something substantive with the United States. And really all they got was this economic prosperity partnership dialogue with the State Department. There was no free trade agreement announced. Now, you could say maybe this also helped initiate the new Trade and Investment Framework Agreement talks that we recently had in the summer, but that could also be explained by simply just the change in U.S. administrations. And so to basically argue, what was this for? I mean, it's pretty tough for the Tsai administration. So, it could become a problem again in the future. I mean, it'd be a shame to see this become a cyclical issue where, Taiwan implements this ban again. It's a constant thorn in TIFA talks. You get another pretty aggressive negotiating Republican administration in the U.S. again. You basically rinse and repeat every 4 to 8 years, and so it's difficult. I'm glad I'm not in the executive yuan or legislative yuan or having to make these decisions.
That was very diplomatic, Reilly. Good answer.
I think the reality is the situation is far worse than that in a sense. Taiwan has got itself into a very difficult situation because it brought in, for understandable reasons, this idea of having referenda. But certainly in the UK, I think we've learnt the dangers of holding referenda because far too often, actually, people are taking or making decisions not on the basis of what the question is, but on their gut feeling about the government of the day. And I think that's a particular problem in Taiwan, that we have seen both main political parties actually acting in a completely irresponsible way on referenda. They use them to berate the other party rather than actually taking a strategic approach of what is in the real interests of Taiwan. And that, I fear, is going to be the problem in December. I don't see the real necessary strategic engagement with the public about why this has to be done. I mean, there is some, but is it adequate? But you've got sort of the opposition in the style, we're doing this because we can, just try, let's make life difficult for the government. But it doesn't solve anything, it just makes things difficult. And that's the reality of it. Now, having said that, let's assume the referendum goes the wrong way from the point of view of the government. Does that affect its Cptpp application? On the face of it, no. But it does send a signal to Cptpp members that some of what they want to see happen might be difficult to get Taiwan to sign up to. Will it make the US less inclined to lobby other Cptpp members for Taiwanese accession? I suspect not, because I think this is driven very much by USTR. which, as a former state colleague said to me, is a law unto itself. I don't think it will affect too many people in Congress. It will have some impact on state, but not that much. So it's not critical, but it doesn't help matters. It doesn't make life easy.
Excellent. So I'm going to turn now to the audience Q&A. Now I have a question, two questions here from Tina Chung with the Voice of America. The first question relates to the economic prosperity and partnership dialogue. They've identified, areas such as the digital economy, supply chain resiliency, semiconductors, public health, and others. The question is, could this forum serve as a stepping stone for a possible U.S.-Taiwan FTA or BTA? Perry, do you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think it could, in the sense that the Biden administration has been very explicit and clear in the issues that they see as vital tackling to help restore global economic recovery as well as domestic economic recovery. And those are these issues of healthcare and pandemic preparedness, supply chain resiliency, the digital economy, semiconductors. And as one of our earlier speakers really enumerated, Taiwan's performance in those discrete areas has been impressive and has been recognized by the Biden administration as impressive. So I think, yes, that opens a door that could go in the direction of FTA negotiations.
I would, if I could just throw
Sure.
a word of caution into there. I hope so. I hope that this, along with the TIFA combined, can convince, the Biden administration to really pull the trigger on this. I think Congress would be very supportive of, an FTA with Taiwan. The only thing, my caution is, I hope that the EPPD doesn't become a substitute for an FTA, because I believe that's sort of what we've seen in the past with the TIFA. Folks in USTR sort of solved the TIFA platform as a substantial or significant alternative to any actual formal trade agreement. Why bother putting pen to paper when you can just call someone up and keep it informal? So hopefully, it can lead to an FTA. I'm worried that there will be some who argue that it's enough of a substitute for one.
Right. Now, the second question from the Voice of America. Reuters has reported that U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said last week that the United States is planning to launch an Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as early as the beginning of next year, and that her Asia visit was to lay the groundwork for potential partnerships. What would this framework do in terms of substituting for the U.S. absence from the Cptpp? And could this be an opportunity for Taiwan to be included in the new economic framework? Shihoko, do you want to take that? Yeah, looks like you're eager to take this question.
Yes. So Secretary Raimondo has made this statement a number of times about the United States not signing on to the Cptpp, but rather establishing its own alternative vision of a trade deal, essentially. There has been a lot of raised eyebrows in the region about a US-led model that would replace the Cptpp. I believe that given where we are now with the the expansion of the trade agreement at this stage, for the emergence of yet another deal, given that RCEP will be in place from next year, will only muddy the waters further. And so the United States, of course, is free to propose any alternative vision or supplemental trade deal but whether it will gain traction or not is highly debatable. So that leads to answering the second question about Taiwan being part of it. I believe the more effective way for the United States to support Taiwan economically, and bear in mind that US support for Taiwan from a security perspective has been fairly clear and it's been robust, but it's Washington's support for Taiwan's securing Taiwan's economic space internationally has been fairly weak. So it would probably be much more effective for it to continue to pursue bilateral engagement.
Any other takers from the other panels? Okay. If not, with the remaining 4 minutes that we have, I want to combine a couple of the questions that we received. They're somewhat related here, all on Cptpp here. But the first question is, besides Japan, what Cptpp members will be easiest for Taiwan to gain support from, and what will this support look like? Which members will be most reluctant to support Taiwan's application? And the second question related to this is, and this is also very timely, but related to Cptpp, but what can be expected from Cptpp members with regard to China's economic coercion practices? Can Taiwan leverage this in its negotiations? So 2 sets of questions related to Cptpp, but quite different. But yeah, you may all sort of take the question that you like to address. This isn't addressed to any particular person, so anyone?
Okay, well, if I go first,
Michael.
the most supportive, apart from Japan, at least so far on the record, I think New Zealand has spoken quite positively. But I think you could term any one of New Zealand, Australia, depending on how the election goes. In terms of the toughest, hard to say, but I think Malaysia is perhaps surprisingly difficult to win over, simply because they are most sensitive and most susceptible to Chinese economic coercion. They think that way. The Latin Americans less so. So that would be my thought on that one.
I would add to Michael's list Canada as a potentially supportive member for Taiwan within the Cptpp. And I would take a look at Belt and Road Initiative relationships as just one screen for evaluating where opposition might come from.
Yeah, I would, to talk about Chinese economic coercion. I think there is a lot more concern these days, both of the potential economic coercion and of course the political coercion. And so Japan, Mexico, I think have both come out and said they're not going to give China any pass in these negotiations. It's going to be by the book, which I think, at least for me, has been a concern because sometimes things can get negotiated out throughout some of these processes. And so to know that at least a couple members will be keeping as much of that's still in Cptpp from the original TPP in, I think that's important. Now, like I was saying earlier as well, so for Taiwan's potential membership, Japan again has been very vocal in its support. I think again, just kind of reiterating it, I think the U.S. can and should play a role in helping support. Both Japan has influence in Southeast Asia, and so those Cptpp members, while the U.S. could potentially help convince Canada and Mexico and maybe some folks in Latin America as well that Taiwan should be a member of the Cptpp.
Well, that brings us just right up to Shihoko. Did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to add that
Yes.
if China is serious about meeting the hurdles to join the CPTPP, then invariably it would actually tone down, or actually stop economic coercion because it does not meet the needs of joining CPTPP. So it actually could be a good thing if China were to be serious about meeting the needs of accession.
Well, very reasonable point to end on. And that brings us just right up a little past 10:30. And that concludes our program today. And I want to thank our excellent panelists and also our live audience members. My apologies for not being able to get through all your questions as well as my questions. I have plenty of questions that I wanted to ask more, but we are at time now. And finally, I just want to make thanks again the generous support of the O Family Charitable and Educational Fund. And for everyone, stay safe and stay healthy. And for our friends in the United States, happy Thanksgiving. Take care, everybody.